Hello everyone, I'll be presenting Wendell Berry for my senior author. And before we begin talking about his life, make sure you have the handout printed and something to write with. Just to give you a brief overview that during this presentation, we will go back and forth between PowerPoint and videos from an interview with Wendell Berry. All the responses are things that Wendell Berry has said throughout his works and interviews. And now to begin, we will be listening to his poem, For the Hog Killing, which is about practical ethics.
Let them stand still for the bullet and stare the shooter in the eye. Let them die while the sound of the shot is in the air. Let them die as they fall. Let the jugular blood spring hot to the knife. Let its freshet be full. Let this day begin again the change of hogs into people, not the other way around. For today, we celebrate again our lives wedding with the world. For by our hunger, by this provisioning, we renew the bond.
Now we're going to talk about Wendell Berry's childhood. He was the first of 4 children born on August 5th, 1934 in New Castle, Kentucky, and eventually would move to Port Royal, Kentucky for the majority of his childhood. His parents were John Marshall and Virginia Berry, and they brought about Berry's love for farming from the day he was born. This is very important because John Marshall, Berry's father, worked as a legal representative for farmers' rights and was so successful that they offered him a government position. John Berry chose to return to his multi-generational farm with his family, knowing that is what was most important to him. John Berry was soon offered to work on the committee orchestrating the New Deal under FDR, and happily accepted this offer in order to transfer his knowledge of farming as a lifestyle into government regulations. On the other hand, Berry's mother, Virginia, was one of the first women in her community that attended a 4-year university and was extremely influential in Berry's life. She encouraged his writing passions for conserving nature. It is very important to notice that Wendell Berry is known for being such a good farmer mostly because of his parents. Wendell Berry's parents chose farming because that is what they loved to do, rather than being forced into it. His parents instilled in him the desire to farm out of passion, not because he had to. This next slide on education is here just in case you missed what was said in the interview.
I am here today with Wendell Berry, who is known for being a famous American author, critic, farmer, but most importantly, an environmental activist. He is known as the Mad Farmer or being an angry advocate for a revolution in the treatment of the land. Throughout this interview, I will be asking Berry questions over every aspect of his life, including education, his works, lifestyle, and much more. Let's begin. Let me just start by thanking you for allowing this interview to happen. I know it's not your favorite scenario, but we really appreciate it.
Hello, it's no problem at all. Honestly, it is hard for me to be around all this technology, but I thought if it lets me advocate for what I love, then something good can come of it.
What is the historical context and the time you grew up in, and how did that affect you?
Well, I grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. It had a huge impact on me specifically, economically, and it soon accumulated into me straying away from my big business to support small family shops and led me to soon participate in acts of civil disobedience. At this time, I found my hatred for technology and saw how it corrupts the world and people around us. And that is why I don't have any televisions in my house and one phone for me and my wife in case of an emergency, of course.
Tell me about your education as a young child to middle age.
Well, I enrolled in secondary school at a military institute in 1948 and graduated after 4 years. I really didn't care much about my education until I got admitted to the University of Kentucky. I received my bachelor's and master's in English and really found my love for writing and reading at this time. I didn't write for the grade anymore. I wrote because I found passion for it.
You must have met so many wonderful people during your time studying at the University of Kentucky. Can you tell me about a few of them?
I love my professors and made many friends, but with my age now, the only person I can really remember was meeting Tanya, my beautiful wife. I have to tell you the story because I remember it like it was yesterday. I was in Miller Hall visiting my friends, and I looked across the hall to see Tanya reading a book while leaning against a wooden post that was at the top of the stairs. I instantly asked her on a date, and we have been inseparable ever since.
Wow, that is amazing. Is the Miller Hall still there today?
Actually, I came to find out it was being deconstructed and rebuilt, so I drove up and politely asked if I could keep the wooden post that Tanya was leaning against, and today it stands at the base of the staircase in the middle of our house and represents the life we have built together.
Has Tanya been supportive throughout your writing career and passion to be an environmentalist?
Tanya is not only my best friend, but has also been my editor, publisher, and inspiration for many of my works. I live with a woman that I have loved since I can remember, and I am a strong believer that to love someone and to marry them is a way of acknowledging and accepting a responsibility. If you make a commitment and you stick to it, there will be rewards.
Thank you. As I read before our interview, in more than 50 books, Tanya has always played an important editorial role. Their partnership has yielded to 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. One of your most famous novels, Hannah Coulter, is inspired by Tanya and her gentle and kind spirit. We will get to that later in this presentation. Now let's learn about your travels and your middle-aged life. Back to the slideshow.
At the age of 23, Tanya and Wendell Berry ventured to California after he was accepted to Stanford's creative writing program. This was huge for Wendell Berry and the start of his successful writing career. During this time, he met Wallace Stegner, who was known as a dean of Western writers. Stegner was Berry's biggest influence at this time, not only because they were both environmentalists, but because Stegner wrote letters of recommendation for Berry and was a mentor to Berry in his early life. After the writing club ended, Berry was able to apply for a regionalist and writers club, which was in Europe. This is Berry's second major place to travel to, and at this time, it was international. Berry spent a year in Europe with Tanya. They traveled and wrote, spending much of their time in Italy and France. However, Tuscany was Berry's favorite. He said, "I have a tremendous debt to Tuscany. The Tuscans terrace hillside as steep as these here, and made them wonderfully and diversely productive. I learned a lot from that." Berry was influenced by his childhood education and travels. We see Mark Twain do this as well when he drew inspiration from his home status of Missouri. Lastly, Wendell Berry made his last excursion to New York City. He was 28 and was given the opportunity to teach in the English department at NYU. He liked his job but noticed something was missing, so he decided to return to Kentucky in 1964 at the age of 30 to settle down with Tanya, which they had been planning for. Now back to the interview to find out what Wendell and Tanya wanted to do in Kentucky.
Now tell me about the Lane's Landing and what you and Tanya did back in Kentucky.
Lane's Landing is where Tanya and I still live today. I still worked as a professor, this time back at the University of Kentucky. I was there for quite a while teaching creative writing for 13 years. This is when I started publishing some of the most popular works.
I would love to hear about your literary accomplishments, but first a few more questions on this topic. What was your mindset going into living back in Kentucky, and what was your role and how did it look like there?
My mindset going into this new phase of life was we don't have a right to ask if we are going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live longer? I was just grateful for the opportunity and wanted to get busy doing what I loved.
Do you think your perspective changed when you moved back to Kentucky with Tanya? If so, how?
Oh, absolutely. The world and our life in it are conditional gifts. We have the world to win it and the use of it to live from, and on the condition that we will take good care of it. And to take good care of it, we have to know it, and we have to know how to take care of it. And to know it and to be willing to take good care of it, we also have to love it. We've ignored all that all these years. I felt a responsibility being back in the hometown. I needed to step up and show leadership about what I cared about most.
What do you think it requires to be a leader?
Leadership consists of people simply see something that needs to be done and they start doing it. I saw my passion for the environment and saving animals and got to work.
What would you say to young people who have a passion for changing problems in the world?
I would like to say to the young people, don't get into this with the idea that you will solve all the problems to this in your lifetime. The important thing to do is learn all you can about where you are, and if you're going to work, then it becomes even more important.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. I think we're almost excited about hearing about your works. Any last words to your readers?
A warning to my readers, do not think I'm gentle because I speak in praise of gentleness, and elegance because I honor the grace. I am bold, honest, and speak from the truth that I found being rooted in Christ and as a farmer.
Tell me a little about the unsettling of America.
Resettling of America means putting enough people on the land to take proper care of it and pay them decently for doing it. In our families, we know the history of people having to leave the country, but they couldn't make a living there, and it's the history of the rural America. But because they left because they couldn't make a living in the endowment. The idea that you have to go somewhere else or leave a fertile country is preposterous. And it's a result of the wrong idea of what we mean by making a living in the first place. To make a living, to make a killing, it's to have enough.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Now let's look at your most famous work in more.
As you can tell in the video interview, the way Mr. Berry talks is very choppy and doesn't make sense all the time. This is just like what we see in the book Unsettling of America. On page 12 it says, "All the ancient wisdom that has come down to us consoles otherwise. It tells us that work is necessary to us, as much a part of our condition as morality. That good work is our salvation and our joy. That dishonesty or self-serving work is our curse and our doom. We have tried to escape the sweat and sorrow promised in Genesis, only to find that in order to do so, we must forswear love and excellence, health and joy." This quote perfectly sums the bluntness that Berry published in this novel of essays. He is calling people out for showing hypocrisy. He sees them saying that they want to protect their land and animals at all costs, and then right when Berry comes back to live in Kentucky, he sees the exact opposite happening. But don't worry, because he won't let it get by. People were very offended at the essays because they were harsh and calling for a change immediately. To summarize the unsettling of America, we see that Berry is implying that we are unsettling in America what our ancestors settled so long ago. This is a collection of essays that show Berry's bold part in denouncing societies and their way of life. He argues that agriculture is the foundation of America's greater culture. He makes a strong case against the U.S. government's agricultural policy, which promotes practices leading to overproduction, pollution, and soil erosion. The themes we see from Unsettling in America is modernization and community. For the theme modernization, we see Berry emphasizing throughout the whole book that modernization has destroyed the simple life of a farmer, and the government has done very little to change that. As we heard in his interview, that Berry is not a fan of technology. Now, this isn't all technology, but just the ones that major industrialization and modernization movements have created that make humans lazy and that have caused us to turn to slavery many years ago. On page 41 it says, "In all this, few people whose testimony would have mattered have seen the connection between the modernization of agricultural techniques and the disintegration of the culture and the communities of farming, and the consequent disintegration of the structures in urban life. What we have called agricultural progress has, in fact, involved the forcible displacement of millions of people." Now on to the next theme of community. Berry gives the idea that community is the solution to all his problems that industrialization proposes. The theme of community is important to this collection due to the healing powers it possesses to both land and the people living in it. On page 12 it says, "Only together can they flourish." Now it is important to remember that many people took this work too harshly because they didn't realize Berry's background of his father representing small farmers and helping them through the hardships of the Great Depression and World War II. This hit very close to home for Berry, and that's what made him even more passionate about it. These are quotes that we see from themes in Unsettling of America. I will let you read those on your own time. This brings us to one of the coolest things about Wendell Berry, which is the Port William membership. Port William is a town inspired by Berry's hometown of Port Royal. It is a long-established farming community situated near the confluence of the Ohio and Kentucky rivers. Berry wrote poems, short stories, essays, and novels that included 7 generations of characters that lived in the town at some point or another. This compares with Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia. He created a map of Port William that is in most of his works under the Port William series. It is truly amazing to read a majority of the memberships that contradict each other and that is kept track just from Wendell Berry's memory. Port William is a setting of the next major work that we will be analyzing that is called Hannah Coulter, which he wrote in 2004. To summarize this novel, Hannah Coulter, who narrates the entire work as an elderly woman, tells her story from her childhood all the way to being a 2-time widow, reflecting on the most important moments of her life. This takes place during the Great Depression and World War II in Port William, Kentucky. The story is separated into 3 different parts of her life. The first part tells of Hannah as a young girl who lives on a farm with her father, stepmother, and grandmother. Her grandmother has the biggest impact on her life, and she encourages Hannah to educate herself, get a job, and find a place of her own. She graduates high school as valedictorian and meets a man named Virgil, who would soon become Hannah's first husband. He sadly was recruited to war and dies in battle while Hannah was pregnant with her first child. As we move to the second part of the story, we see Hannah mature into a woman, becoming a mother and processing the death of a loved one. Soon, Hannah meets Nathan, who works on a farm. The two were eventually married. They had 2 sons together and lived a very happy life. Lastly, in part 3, Nathan gets cancer and dies, leaving Hannah widowed for the second time. The story ends with her grandchildren visiting her, giving her the support she needs during a very hard time. When analyzing this work, I saw themes of loss and love. Many people misinterpret the theme for this work being death because Hannah lost 2 husbands. But as you look more into the details, we see that they did not just die for random reasons. Virgil from going into war and Nathan from cancer. We see Barry's opinion concerning the justification for war, and that is a result of modernization and humans wanting more than they can handle, and more than what God has already gave them. Second, we see the theme of love. Even though it wasn't the happiest of endings, Hannah's marriages were filled with loyalty and sacrifice. In her marriage with Virgil, Hannah said, "We were coming together in the presence of something good that was possible in this world. I have to see it now as a sad hope, because we were able to use up so little of it, but it was no less of a beautiful one." That was on page 28. And in her marriage with Nathan, she said, "My life with Nathan turned out to be a long life, an actual marriage with trouble in it. I'm not complaining. Troubles came as they were bound to, as the promise were made had warned us that they would." That was on page 62. As we see from these quotes, Hannah's marriages with Virgil was unrealistic because of the time of war they were in. With Nathan, it was more difficult, but in the end, more rewarding, because we see more of a partnership than a rushed young romance that we saw with Virgil. Like I said during the interview with Mr. Barry, this novel was inspired and dedicated to his wife Tanya. This is because Tanya's lasting impact on Barry. She showed him support in all of his decisions, unconditionally loved him, and sacrificed her own desires to let Barry live out his dreams. Tanya also resembles many characteristics of Hannah of being a loving mother and a devoted wife. Now moving on to Wendell Berry's works of poetry. For this part of the literature, I decided to read the Mad Farmer poems and Peace of the Wild Things. In the Mad Farmer poems, we see a collection of free verse poetry that express Berry's passion for old-fashioned farming practices. The Mad Farmer title is to show us that once a peaceful farmer who represents Wendell Berry has been turned mad by the modernization and industrialization around him. This collection includes prayer, insults to big businesses, how to deal with people in the world, and so much more. The next work of poetry I read from Wendell Berry was Peace of the Wild Things. This novel took a much different approach than A Mad Farmer. Berry has a calm perspective talking about the beauty of nature and provides simple meditations for all aspects of life. He is encouraging and helpful for the environment and the community around him. This was written before the Mad Farmer book, showing how Wendell was before the chaos of technology and businesses changed him. We will now read a couple poems from each book to see the transition from peaceful, untroubled Berry to the infuriated Mad Farmer. The top blue represents Peace of Wild Things, and the bottom is for the Mad Farmer. I will only be reading a few poems because of limited time. First, I'll be reading the one to Peace. All goes back to the earth, as so I do not desire pride of excess of power, but he contentment made by men who have had little, the fisherman's silence, receiving the river's grace, the gardener's musing on rose. I lack the peace of simple things. I'm never wholly in place. I found no peace or grace. We see the world to by fire, our way lighted by burning men, and that has been my mind and made me think of darkness and wish for the dumb life of roots. Second, I'll be reading The Man Born to Farming. The grower of trees, the gardener, the man born of farming, whose hands reach into the ground and sprout. To him the soil is a divine drug. He enters into death yearly and comes back rejoicing. He has seen the light lie down in the dung heap and rise again in the corn. His thought passes along the row, ends like a mole. What a miraculous seed he has swallowed, that the designed sentence of his love flows out of his mouth, like a vine clinging in the sunlight, and like water descending into the dark. One of the poems from Peace of the Wild Things that shows this very worldview says this: "People use drugs, legal and illegal, because their lives are intolerably painful or dull. They hate their work and find no rest in their leisure. They are estranged from their families and their neighbors. It should tell us something that in healthy societies, drug use is celebrative, convivial, and occasional. whereas among us it is lonely, shameful, and addictive. We need drugs apparently because we have lost each other. If you haven't already seen in his works, we can see that Wendell Berry is a very strong Christian. He uses the Bible as a moral compass and believes that God has power over all. He views nature as the ultimate reality. Berry states that the world is maintained every day by the same force that created it. It is in my faith and belief that all creatures live and breathe by God's breath. This means that everything is holy. Berry believes God is the highest power, and he gave us earth, showing us that we have a moral responsibility to take care of it. Berry also believes that human nature is both good and evil. We see examples of this in The Mad Farmer, when he warns his readers of people involved in big businesses, greed, money, etc. He then encourages that if you were to ever deal with someone like this, you should love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, love someone who does not deserve it. Finally, he also believes that good in the world is earned by doing actions that reflect Christ and protecting the land that he gives us, and that the ultimate reality is God. Now, let's look at the final interview to dive deeper into what Berry believes in.
Do you still consider yourself a Christian?
I still consider myself a person who takes the gospel very seriously, and I read it, and I'm sometimes ashamed by it, and sometimes utterly baffled by it. There is a good bit of the gospel that I understand accurately, and I'm hanging on for the parts that I don't understand. I'm willing to endure the shame of falling short for the price of admission.
What type of people do you put your faith in?
The ones who are committed, these people here today listening, the ones who make an effort, who see change that needs to be made in the world and start doing it. I believe the world and our life in it are conditional gifts. You have to take good care of it. You have to love it.
What is something that motivates you to keep pursuing a faith with God?
It's the grace of the world. People of religious faith know that the world is maintained every day by the same force that created it. All creatures live by breathing God's breath and by participating in his spirit. This whole thing is holy. There are no sacred and unsacred. There are only sacred and desecrated place. We've ignored the importance of preserving God's earth all these years. I'm not saying any of this to show off my faith. I'm a man crude as any, ignorant, stubborn, angry, fully of fits and furies. That I may have spoken well at times is not natural. A wonder is what it is.
To summarize what we heard in the interview, we saw that Wendell Berry further believes that traditional values such as marital fidelity and strong community ties are essential for the survival of humankind. He is a strong Christian who places God and the nature as the ultimate reality. On page 5 in Pieces of Wild Things, he wrote a poem called Canticle, in which I will read now. What death means is not this: the spirit, triumph in the body's fall, praising its absence, feeding on music. If life can't justify and explain itself, death can't justify and explain it. A creed in a grave never did equal the life of anything. Yellow flowers sprout in the clefts of ancient stones at the beginning of April. The black clothes of the priest are turned against the frail yellow of sunlight and petal. They wait in their blackness to earn joy by dying. They trust that nothing holy is free, and so their lives are paid. Money slots in the altar rails make a jukebox of the world. The mind paying as gnawed coins for the safety of ignorance. I chose this poem because it shows us that everything in life has many unanswered questions that only God knows the answers to. Death is not praising its absence or feeding on music, but it's to find your calling for what God has planned for you to do. When reading his works, I automatically thought of when we read The Princess, the Laddie, and the Pie by Gene S. Porter in class last quarter. It was very difficult to find differences between these two authors, but the main contrast is the background that these authors grew up in. Gene S. Porter is known for being a novelist, photographer, and a naturalist. I'm sure you remember some information about her from Dr. H's discussion, but to recap, she was rooted in the belief that nature holds the key to life. She was self-educated and was the first conservationist naturalist. She provided hope for characters because she never got that in her life. While Berry is known as a poet, farmer, writer, and activist. Both of these authors felt obligated to protect God's creation. Some common themes between the two works are sacrifice, love, and reality. They saw nature as a positive force and not a negative one. They were both viewed as very strong naturalists in society and brought awareness to preserving nature because God gave it to us. Barry can also be compared to Jack London and Henry Thoreau, as they both shared their love for nature. The next quote I'll be reading is from the guy that interviewed Barry. His name is Bill Myers. He says, "Over the years, he has called himself an agrarian, a pacifist, and a Christian. Albeit of an eccentric kind, he has written against all forms of violence and destruction of land, communities, and human beings, and argued that the modern American way of life is the scheme of violence. He is an anti-capitalist moralist and a writer of praise for what he admires, the quiet, mostly uncelebrated labor and affection that keeps the world whole and might still redeem it. He is also an acerbic critic of what he dislikes, particularly modern individualism, and he emphasizes on family and marriage, and his ambivalence toward abortion mark him as an outsider to the left." I will now be playing a clip from Barry's interview with Bill that shows a little bit of Barry's passion for civil disobedience.
The contrariness of the mad farmer. I am done with apologies. If contrariness is my inheritance and destiny, so be it. If it is my mission to go in at exits and come out at entrances, so be it. I have planted by the stars in defiance of the experts, and tilled somewhat by incantation and by singing, and reaped as I knew by luck and heaven's favor, in spite of the best advice.
He is one of, if not the great writer at work in American letters right now. He's built this body of work that's coherent, cohesive, powerful, beautiful, quite amazing. And it also happens that it's about the most important subject that we have, whether or not we're going to be able to build the kind of communities that can successfully inhabit this earth or not.
As he nears 80 years of age, Barry is going beyond words to civil disobedience.
Keep up the good fight, y'all.
In 2011, he joined a 4-day sit-in at the Kentucky governor's office to protest the mountaintop removal of coal. What prompted that? Man your age.
Well, good company. What prompted me was the thought that when you have a major problem in your state to which state government is utterly indifferent, and you've taken every obvious and legitimate recourse trying to meet and talk and influence and demonstrate and speak and write, and nothing had worked.
Barry has won over 25 minor awards for his literature. This is for all of his poems, essays, short stories, and novels. This most significant award he was received was with the National Humanities Medal presented to him by former President Obama. This award signified Barry's leadership in the organic farming movement that he started in 1977 with the publication of The Unsettling of America, and has continued ever since. What is Wendell Berry up to today? Today, Wendell Berry is 86 years old and he is still very healthy. He still lives with his wife Tanya at Lane's Landing. He occasionally participates in acts of civil disobedience, but he decided to slow down because of small health issues. Besides getting older, he still writes regularly and has the same passion for farming that he did as a child. 3 things that you should remember about Wendell Berry. Berry argues that the key to happiness is through simple living. Berry thinks you can achieve this through no technology. He would argue that the key to happiness is simplicity, which explains why he hardly complains about his life even to this day. Wendell Berry does not have a television or computer in his home and thinks that all farming and environmental products should be free of chemicals to protect our land. Berry stays true to his roots while being surrounded by a modern and chaotic world. It would be a lot easier for Wendell Berry to change his views for the world, but he is strong in his faith and beliefs of how things should be done in our communities. He looks at farming and being an environmentalist as a way to take care of what God has given him. Berry is loyal to nature that God has provided us with and looks at it as an opportunity, not a burden. I will leave you with this quote from Wendell Berry that says, All we can do is be the best example that we can possibly be. Wendell Berry. Thank you. For your in-class assignment, by yourself and a group of 2 to 3 people, write a short poem that relates to Wendell Berry. This can reflect his writing patterns, worldview, childhood, or anything learned in the lecture video. I attached poems he wrote below to give you some ideas. For example, you can write a poem about his perspective before he became the Mad Farmer, or after, to demonstrate his harsh view of big businesses, technology, farming techniques, etc. Be prepared to read your poem in our class discussion on MS Teams at 8:30 on May 5th. This only needs to be 3 to 5 stanzas, and I'm not going to be picky about it. It just has to relate to Wendell Berry and what you learned in the video. For homework, you will be reading a variety of poems written by Berry to further analyze his worldview. You will lastly then read Chapter 7 from Hannah Coulter and about the heartbreaking life she lived as a 2-time widow. Come to Heart of Discussion with the answers to homework questions and with any questions you have for me. Thank you for listening.